Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a young, accomplished, and successful food entrepreneur from New Delhi, India, Mr. Aditya Bagri. Aditya, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Garg, for having me on the show. It's indeed
Thank
a privilege to be here.
Thank you. Aditya is the director of Bagrrys India Private Limited, India's leading brand of breakfast cereals and health foods. And before I ask him any questions, I must tell you that I've been a regular consumer of Bagrrys cereals for many, many years. So Aditya, let me start by asking you, you're very young. Tell me about your journey in brief, and what was the inspiration for your dad to start Bagrrys?
So, thank you so much, sir, for having us here. And it's a pleasure to speak and engage and learn, from this platform. So, I'm a second generation in what's been completely a family-run business.
Mm,
And for my father, who was first gen for the current business that we operate, but having come from a family business background, he's been inspirational for all of us. So as many first gen entrepreneurs, second generations always look forward to what kind of platforms been provided to them, and it's something that we truly cherish. But seeing his journey, he started out at a fairly young age. So he started out at the age of 19. He set up his first food processing unit. So the family was in the domain of flour milling. So we had flour mills across the country, and
mm,
while growing up by 19, he had already understood the art of flour milling. So
mm,
he set up his first flour mill unit, and he did that with zero capex. So no one wanted to invest behind a 19-year-old. So
mm,
he requested the family that give me all your scrap machinery, which is lying
mm,
idle in your plants,
mm,
and I'll build out a plant for you.
mm,
He did that and turned that into an extremely successful and profitable venture. He told me that he'd actually spent time under machines,
mm.
even though he's a commerce graduate, and he'd also done a couple of years of law. I think he was
Wow.
aspiring to be a lawyer at that point of time.
Mm,
So he got into flour milling and set up a fairly successful flour mill business by the time he was 19 to 21.
mm,
And for a decade, he decided to organize the space. So flour milling in India was highly regulated.
mm,
It was unorganized, and he did not want to do something which was not institutional. His intent was to build an institution. So
mm,
he tied up with brands back then like Nestle, Modern Bread, ITC, Mondelez. So these happen to become B2B customers for flour.
mm,
And he wanted to make high quality flour and give them to B2B customers for, products such as Maggi noodles, such
mm,
as, baby food, such as bakery items and so on. So what he was very cognizant of is that the line of business that he'd enter into is flour milling, which is inherently unhealthy.
mm,
So he was very conscious of that, and he wanted to actually do something about it. He wanted to make sure that he has a social responsibility to it. So if you he'd read Mahatma Gandhi's books called India of My Dreams, which spoke about the nutritive value of choker, which is wheat bran, which
right.
is the outer layer of wheat grain, which gets thrown away in flour milling because it's
Mm,
unstable. So he was very inspired by that. He read that as a teenager. So when he got
mm,
into billing also, he kept on trying to do something with brand,
mm,
and it is highly unstable. It goes rancid immediately, pretty much
mm,
on
mm,
processing flour. So
mm,
he created a process internally to stabilize it, and started taking small amounts of wheat bran and packing it in self-pack labels and distributing it across stores in Delhi. And I think a lot of people back at the office who still work with us thought he's gone crazy, because here's someone who's processing thousands of tons of wheat. He's
mm,
getting excited about selling a few kilos of byproduct, which is essentially what they felt was
mm,
cattle feed.
mm,
But the response which he got was fantastic, because people started writing back. And back in the
mm,
day, I'm talking about 1991, people wrote letters, people wrote, called in saying that our digestive health has improved. It's helped us manage our lipid profiles.
mm,
I distinctly remember a letter of someone saying that we had a child who was autistic, and his bowel movements were came under control, which was a big relief for the parents. And then
right.
subsequently, he got into oats and muesli. And the idea wasn't to create a modern day startup. We were just as a family very passionate about
Mm,
healthy eating, and
Mm,
that translated into what was a passion project of the 90s, and then somewhere around the early 2000s, became a proper business. So
mm,
for me and my sisters, growing up, we got a ringside view of how this was happening,
mm,
spent time with them at exhibitions. The family was pretty involved, in what we were doing. We
mm,
had a chocolate cereal which we launched where the cover of the chocolate cereal, the packaging was taken out of a fairy tale book that my mother used to read to me.
mm,
So
mm.
it's just one of those homegrown family run
Yeah,
businesses.
yeah.
And we happened to become an FMCG business, but the
Mm,
intent was to do something very honest, very clean label,
mm,
and purely out of passion. So stuff which is very fashionable now to have honest, clean label ingredients. We would encourage people to read the label in the 90s,
mm.
and seeing that evolution's happened now is excellent.
Oh,
But
yes.
we were maybe 2 or 3 decades ahead of the conversation that we're having.
Correct, correct, correct. But you often mention, and when I was reading about you and about your company, um, I was fascinated to see that you believe breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more on why do you believe breakfast is
Yeah.
such an important meal, especially in the Indian context?
So I think if you look at our diets, then obviously there's a fair amount of calorific value, and it's a combination of diet and lifestyle.
Mm,
In terms of what it entails,
mm,
and if you've got kids, raising kids also, you'll see that if you send them hungry to school, invariably they'll come back extremely tired. But if you manage to give them a fulfilling breakfast, then the energy levels through the day are much better sustained. So from that perspective, while there's lots of science to debate that one should be fasting intermittently and the time of breakfast could be earlier or later and so on,
mm,
I think
mm,
there is a fairly rational science to believe that one has to have uh, a wholesome meal to start the day,
mm,
something that gives you a sustained release of energy, something that keeps your tummy full, yet does not make you feel sluggish. And from that perspective, breakfast is a very important part of that. And I think most of your carbohydrate loading that gives you the energy throughout the day should also come at the beginning of the day when you need that
correct,
energy to stay.
correct.
Unfortunately, in modern day lifestyles, earlier we had the luxury of having prepared breakfast at home.
Mm,
uh, the breakfast table was something which was more conversational. With today's time and age, I think majority of the people are either skipping breakfast or having breakfast out of home, or they don't really have time to have a
correct.
very elaborate breakfast. And I think that's where giving something which is nutritious, which is balanced, which delivers the requisite functional experience, and yet something palatable
Mm,
comes into the picture. So that's where breakfast cereals have a much larger role to play as households are becoming dual income, becoming
mm,
nuclear,
mm,
where both the parents are working. There's a family where kids have to go to school,
mm.
um, and delivering nutrition in a manner that's convenient yet honestly healthy. I think that's really
Very well said.
that's really.
Great response. And yet, Aditya, given the size and diversity of our country,
Mhm.
breakfasts are different, not just in every home, but every part of this country. How do you, as a brand, handle such huge diversity in breakfast habits across through your product range?
Yeah. So that's a great question. In fact, something that I'm very happy to answer as well, because
Mm,
traditionally Bagrrys as a brand is viewed as an international brand. So
mm,
the consumer perception is that maybe we're a British brand, or we're a brand which is not from India,
mm,
and it's probably a function of the category we operate in, as well as the quality of ingredients that we like to work with. But as an Indian homegrown brand, we actually like to celebrate Indian breakfast. Like, we have a lot of Indian breakfast offerings in our portfolio, which one could make, as well as the fact that we understand Indian consumers better. So, as Indian consumers, we like things which are more flavorful. We like things which are not kacha. We like things which are less pasty.
mm,
So when we developed our range, we realized that obviously there's a diversity of Indian breakfast,
mm.
something that we honestly don't try to compete with. That's there to exist, and it exists for a reason.
Right.
And what we try to do as a brand is to make sure that the products we offer
Mm,
seamlessly blend into those consumers who are trying to make that switch from an Indian breakfast to a Western
Mm,
breakfast. It could
mm,
be twice a day, it could be twice a week, thrice a week, it could be, an occasional consumption, and eventually
mm,
it ropes into a lifestyle change. But what we do is we try and make sure that the key aspects of what we like about our ethnic breakfast stay. So, for example, we make oats which are less pasty because we don't like things, from an Indian perspective, which are very pasty. We like things which are more danedar because our people are used to a danedar dalia.
correct.
We try and make our mueslis in a way that they taste cooked, because if you have
Mm,
mueslis in the West, then they're uncooked. So
mm,
there's almost a raw mouthfeel to it of a raw grain. So our cereals will be more crunchy in terms of the mouthfeel, because that's what the Indian
mm.
palate is used to. And I think
Yeah,
that's what led to relatively early success, because the launch of breakfast cereals as a category in India with large multinationals coming in was actually a failure case study for the first decade,
correct.
because I
Yeah.
don't think it factored in the fact that there is warm milk consumption that happens in India, whereas the categories that we created, which were oats and muesli, both were very well blended with warm milk consumption. They were in
Mm,
fact best with warm milk, and I think that's something which led to early adoption for us as a brand.
mm,
Whereas categories like cornflakes struggled as soon as you put
correct.
warm milk into the picture. So I think those were insights that we took. It's not like we did extensive market research. It was almost intuitive,
Mm,
insights that we took forward to try and build something, and it was built out of passion. Frankly, we were not
absolutely. And you're,
paying.
you're so right. I mean, I remember years ago when I'd be flying on Indian Airlines in those days, and at
Yeah,
breakfast, she would the air hostess would come with a hot jug of milk and a cold jug of milk and say, "What do you
yeah,
want?" And
yeah,
most people would take hot milk. But
yeah,
tell me, as a brand and as an organization, you have done
yeah.
a lot to influence breakfast habits in Indian households.
Yes.
What are the key differences between traditional Indian breakfasts and Bagrry's offerings?
Okay. Okay. So I would say, what we offer, it's more a function of the categories that we've operated in. So we've operated in a category of muesli, which is essentially a Western, breakfast cereal derived from Europe. And muesli came from the origin where the word muse actually is a German word for mix. So it's
Mhm.
essentially a mixture. And whether it's you could have infinite permutations and combinations of muesli depending on what you put in. But the
Correct.
traditional recipes always had this combination of whole grains, nuts, seeds, and berries, and
Mhm.
honey
Mhm.
that was consumed in the Swiss German areas with yogurt.
Yeah.
And there was a, there were studies to show that the lifestyle in terms of longevity, in terms of satiation, in terms of the energy release was much better. So
Mhm.
we tried to emulate that into our muesli.
Mhm.
And essentially, when we launched it in India, we saw that there was acceptance both in the form of breakfast with hot milk, because what we
Mhm.
made did not, get soggy with hot milk. And even if it did get soggy, it had a nice, sweet, palatable, taste. Especially in India, dry fruit consumption is a relatively, big aspect of what we
Correct.
do.
Mhm.
So I think the association with dry fruits definitely helped. And consumers realized that this is making them feel lighter, yet keeping their tummy full for longer. And then the category that we introduced of oats, which I think today has been a very fast growing category, and it's almost become a third staple grain in India after wheat and
Mhm.
rice,
Mhm.
was something that we'd introduced. I think that's a category which blended well with our traditional tastes. So
Mhm.
if you made an oats porridge, it was very close to dalia. And areas of India such as South India, where oats is extremely popular today, and I think early work that our teams did, and I must give them a lot of credit for that in the 90s, is make sure that oats reaches every Indian household in a market like Kerala, which is a
Yeah.
big market for oats. There, the adoption of oats was almost user generated adoption. I'd say that not as much as what we did as a brand, but there was almost user generated adoption where they felt that this porridge could be used not just for breakfast but also lunch and dinner. So they started making savory oats. They started blending oats into their traditional preparations, be it an
Mhm.
idli or a dosa or say a pongal. So I think that adoption was almost
Mhm.
intuitively generated by our consumers. What we did was actually showcase the product,
Mm.
talk about the health benefits, be it the fiber benefits, the weight loss benefits, the heart health benefits, and actually sample out a lot of products. So in fact, I remember that we had an area manager who used to sample out the product every Eid outside masjids
Mm.
in Kerala, because it was one of those foods which would give you energy for longer. So if you had oats in the morning, and that's where the Gulf has a lot of oats consumption now,
Mm.
it gives you sustained energy release.
Mm.
So it had so many functional benefits, and the adoption became a lot quicker. So the intent wasn't to compete with Western breakfast.
Mm.
As an Indian business, the intent was to complement those other traditional Indian breakfasts and offer something as an additional
Correct.
healthier alternative. And then over the decades, I think in sometime about 10, 15 years ago, we actually created a range called Oats for India, which we are very proud of because we actually innovated in the milling technology of oats to
Mm.
create oats atta, oats poha, oats suji, and oats rice. So
Wow.
we took the grain and actually brought it to a consistency of the traditional Indian staple.
Mm.
So that was an innovation we did to actually try and get consumers to make their traditional Indian breakfast offerings
Mm.
using oats, because they were already doing that, but they were using porridge as a flake, which wasn't necessarily the most functionally easy thing to do. If you made an upma, I think you would want that suji like danedar consistency in the upma. You'd want that texture to be there. So as grain millers at heart, we understood that. So we brought that innovation on the table. And I think having that understanding from back end to front end actually helped us, create these things in a small way.
Mm.
Just like we tried to adopt by being the first brand to put breakfast cereal in a pet jar.
Mm.
I think we're a very small business overall in the scheme of breakfast cereals, manufacturing worldwide. But we were the first brand in the world to actually put cereal in a pet jar. And
Mm.
the intent was to create adoption and reuse, because traditionally oats were sold in a tin or
Correct.
in a bag and box format. And as soon as we converted that to a pet jar and said you have a reusable pet jar, and we tied up with
Yeah.
Bird Pet to give pet jar free, that became a very quick adoption exercise where
Correct.
homemakers felt that we could reuse this piece of packaging.
Mm.
And I think adoption became very quick.
Well said.
And interestingly, when our competitors came to India, they launched oats in a pet jar, which was the first time that they'd done that in the world. So I think from our perspective, it was also the method in which we offered
Correct.
the
Correct.
products.
But tell me, Aditya, one of the things that you mentioned a few minutes back was that while we accept that breakfast is a very important cereal, the young
Yeah.
don't have time. And I see a lot of young people running, picking up a coffee somewhere, picking up a sandwich.
Yeah.
While you've invested so much in getting customers to change breakfast habits, and now work is driving them away from breakfast. How are you tackling with that problem?
So I would say that in several aspects, India has always been in a time lag, from
Correct.
from the West.
Hmm.
So in India, we've still got, fair amount of joint families as well as help at home, which can
Hmm.
at least give us the option to
Correct.
make prepared hot breakfast. As
Yeah.
that's changing, I think the consumer lifestyle is changing to a degree that, having cereal with milk or having a quick fix, breakfast which cooks in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I think
Hmm.
those are the first steps of evolution. I think at least in urban India, we've already reached that, to a large degree. The way we are tackling, the future challenge, because the future that we see, and obviously COVID-19 had hit a bit of a pause button where
Hmm.
we saw that everyone had more time at home, be it temporarily to actually enjoy breakfast at home. But with the advent of technology, things getting delivered in 10 minutes in urban
Hmm.
areas, the availability of things on the go, the intent now is not to actually be a breakfast centered solution. It is to be a health centered solution, and
Hmm.
we want to be wherever our consumers are. If they want to have their breakfast in office,
Hmm.
we've developed solutions where the breakfast can be made available on the go. And while a lot of these have been in R&D mode, we've been happy to put a lot of those forward. We're doing smaller packs, we're doing trial packs as well. One very interesting innovation we've done in collaboration with Indigo Airlines,
Hmm.
this was a few years ago,
Hmm.
was actually create an on-the-go cup cereal which was served on board,
Yeah.
where milk was also pre-blended inside. and all you needed to do was add hot or cold water,
Mm.
stir it, and the product was ready. So
Mm.
that was an on-board, on-air solution, because every time we traveled, we realized that there's no breakfast option
Mm.
in budget airlines which are offering
Mm.
food. So
Yeah.
that was a very unique innovation done by us, because typically you have cereal in a cup, but in Western areas, milk is available fairly readily
Yeah.
in terms of easy dispensing units. Whereas in India, you don't normally buy milk on the go. You buy milk mostly for your home consumption.
Correct.
So, we created that innovation, and airlines like Indigo definitely did not carry any milk. So I
Mm.
think that was, a very unique innovation. But our intent now for the future is to actually create solutions where you have healthy eating options throughout the day,
Mm.
both for in-home consumption and especially for out-of-home consumption.
Mm.
And I think the best part is with Q-commerce coming in, adoption of these solutions is getting much easier. Today, if I want
Yes.
a healthy snack bar,
Yeah.
it's delivered to me in 10 minutes.
Absolutely.
There are so many touch points. You've created
Correct.
a fantastic retail chain. I'm sure, those chains are loaded with healthy snack eating options, protein bar options, things that one could go and
Mm.
conveniently pick up on the go if they're at the airport. So I
Mm.
think that is the future.
Very well said. Well said. Uh, what is your view on the role of superfoods and functional foods? And what is the role that they play in Bagrry's products or your portfolio?
So, we are very passionate about, the ingredients we put in. In fact, I honestly believe the reason we exist is our core, very simple philosophy. We've not spent too much energy advertising our products. What we've done is simply tried to use pretty much the best ingredients from around the world that we
Mm.
could get our hands on, which includes a lot of superfoods. And we've been early proponents of using superfoods like quinoa, oats, dry fruits, various berries, and got them in a form where the natural nutrition is retained.
Mm.
So a lot of our focus has been to make sure that every ingredient we use, the natural nutrition is retained. So oats being a superfood, we were first users with oats. We were one of the earliest brands to adopt quinoa. We did a millet muesli back in 2003, where
Mm.
millets were unheard of,
Amazing.
and we did a
Mm.
muesli called 7 a.m. muesli, which basically had seven different grains, which included jawar, bajra, rice, and other grains. And
Mm.
at that point in time, the millet supply chain wasn't good enough for us to sustain that muesli, because
Mm.
a lot of millets actually go rancid on processing. So we
Mm.
everything we do, we want to make sure that if we are committing to a shelf life of 9 months or 12 months, we deliver well and truly beyond that and safe for our consumers. So I think the back end focus has definitely helped. So superfoods play a big role in what we do. In
Mm.
fact, pretty much every ingredient we use, down to the grains, down to the berries, down to the nuts, has been classified as a superfood.
Mm.
And we try and use it in a way that we don't take the natural nutrition away. So, for
Mm.
example, if you're using a mango, or if you're using a papaya, or if you're using a fruit, in many cases, we are working with freeze-dried fruit,
Mm.
which is one of the best ways for you to actually consume fruit if you're not having
Correct.
fresh fruit.
Mm.
So 1 kilo of banana is giving us, 100 grams of freeze-dried banana,
Mm.
and that's what we put in our cereals. And it's whereas the alternative is to actually put something which is sugar-added candy, which is 70% sugar.
Mm.
So that's one big avenue of differentiation, because as a family we believe that it should be something that we should feel safe consuming ourselves and feeding our next generation. So
Well
if
said.
it goes through those two personal benchmarks,
Mm.
then then the other aspects come in of how we can make it commercially feasible, or how we can try and make things which are tastier as well. But the first filter that we put is honestly nutrition, and
Mm.
the fact that should be clean label.
Very interesting.
And we've done that with antioxidants as well. So one of the most natural antioxidants is vitamin E or rosemary, which we've been using for a long time. The benchmark of antioxidants for our category was INS 320, which is BHA, which is banned in Japan since 1958.
Mm.
And in India, it was allowed in breakfast cereals. But I think after a lot of communication around the fact that we are using a natural antioxidant, which is maybe 20 times the price, but it's better for you. We saw that the entire ecosystem moved to INS 306B, or INS 307, which
Mm.
is mixed tocopherols, and essentially called out the fact that BHA is bad for you. So I think those are things where, not whether you're consuming Bagrrys or something else, we've made that little nudge in
Mm.
making the labels healthier.
Amazing. So, Aditya, I have time for one more question. We've spoken about a lot of amazing stuff that you're doing in the area of breakfast. We've spoken of superfoods. What next for Bagrrys? You've got two more big meals, you've got snacks, and you've got an Indian consumer who is
Yeah.
becoming increasingly international.
Yeah. So I think fantastic, questions, sir, and happy to answer that. So I believe the products that we originally started with were focused around, delivering something that's honestly healthy.
Correct.
With the Gandhian inspiration that we had,
Yeah.
the intent was never to just focus on one avenue, which was breakfast. It was to create something that's honestly healthy, that's clean label, that is, trustworthy in terms of the kind of processing it's gone through to make sure it's, safe, and that core philosophy for us is extremely important.
Mm,
So that's what we want to carry forward. The products that we do, going forward might be very different from what we've done right now. Obviously,
mm,
carrying forward some of the core categories like muesli and oats, which I think have a very long way to go in India. But what's next for Bagrrys is actually to become India's most trusted brand for health.
mm,
We believe that trust is very important in today's time and age, where there's been an entire few decades where brands have been built on perception of health rather than genuine health. Our intent, from the beginning has been to be an honestly healthy brand. So we aim consumer trust and repeat loyalty as a very important aspect of what we
mm,
do.
mm,
So we want to cover occasions which are breakfast in home, breakfast out of home, healthy snacking, meals which include
mm,
dinner, which include nutrition for younger kids,
mm,
in a manner that is safe, in a manner that's clean label, and in the form which the consumers would want at that moment. So,
mm,
if you're on the go, you might want to order something from Q-commerce. If you're, at the airport, you might need something healthy. You obviously need, things from the supermarket which build up your grocery
yeah.
items. So a lot of the solutions that we are providing now, I
Mm,
think, are around that. So to just give examples, we've recently entered into healthy snacking with trail mixes.
mm,
We were actually one of the first brands to get into, fox nuts, which has been a rage of late in terms of
mm,
the way the categories evolved. We're trying to get into areas which are a crossover between food and nutraceutical,
mm,
where there is a functional benefit of,
yeah.
say, a certain macro ingredient. So we created the first whey protein-based breakfast cereal in India, where you were delivering a certain grammage of protein per
Mm,
serve, for a high protein requirement that the country is deficient with. So I think the idea is to actually identify key health requirements as well as key functional requirements. Um, for example, there is a huge amount of understanding that dairy may not suit all of us.
yeah.
Obviously, dairy is an integral part of what we do.
Mm,
So we've actually launched plant-based beverages, which is our
mm,
first foray into beverages, where
mm,
we've extended our understanding of nuts and grains into an almond milk and oat milk,
mm, yeah.
and a product that we're incredibly proud of, which is our innovation called a oat and nut milk.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is to actually create a product which is as good as cow's milk in terms of the taste profile,
Mm,
and something that you can drink as is, because changing from milk which is relatively tasty to a
mm,
plant-based alternative is a habit change, and people
mm,
do it for allergy, for lifestyle, for diet reasons. But we wanted to offer something that's truly rich in terms of the experience. So
mm,
that was an innovation done by us, which was our first beverage range launch, and I think
mm,
that's an avenue where we want to invest into food which are foods of the future,
mm,
which could be both Western as well as ethnic.
mm.
But the form has to be something that the new age consumer has to be.
Very well said. Very well said. On that note, Aditya, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about the journey of your incredible organization, your amazing brand, Bagrrys. Uh, we've always heard breakfast like a king, a lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. But you seem to have covered so much ground on the importance of breakfast for each one of us. And I was fascinated to see the way you've built the brand and how you are evolving it even more through plant-based foods, through superfoods, and so many other experiments you're doing with it. Thank you for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for having me on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.